What would you do if you were disrespected every day, but inside you held a secret that could change everything? What if the bullies thought you were weak, but in reality, they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives? This is the story of Jamal Carter, a black boy who transferred to Brookside High and quickly became the target of Blake Harrison, the king of the school. They thought he was an easy target, but they had no idea that Jamal was not someone who could be easily defeated. The cruel jokes turned into violence, but when Jamal fought back, the whole school was shocked. A twist no one expected. A lesson Blake would never forget. Get ready for a story of justice, redemption, and the downfall of a bully. Brookside is a small town where it feels like nothing ever changes. Quiet streets, small roadside shops, and a community where everyone knows each other. Here, everyone is the same, not just in thought but also in skin color. So when Jamal Carter, a black boy, showed up at Brookside High, he instantly became the center of attention. In this school, students of color were nearly non-existent, and if they were always on the outskirts. Jamal didn't care. He was used to it. His family had moved to Brookside because of his mother's job, but from the moment he set foot here, he knew he didn't belong. On his first day, when he walked into the classroom, Jamal could feel the stares from everywhere. Some students whispered softly, others sneered. He chose a seat in the corner of the room, far from the gazes, keeping a safe distance. Not because he was shy, but because he knew he didn't need friends here. But it was his silence that attracted the wrong kind of attention, the kind that saw bullying as the school's rule. Brookside High had its unspoken rules, and Jamal would soon learn them the hard way. Brookside High doesn't have an official hierarchy of power, but everyone knows that the real rules of the place aren't set by the teachers or the administration. They are set by Blake Harrison, the unspoken ruler of the school. As the son of the head football coach, Blake not only has the advantage of status, but also wields absolute influence over the students. He's the person everyone wants to be on the side of, or at least, no one dares to stand against. Blake doesn't operate alone. He's always surrounded by a loyal group of satellites, individuals willing to do whatever it takes to maintain the power they've built. Ryan Carter, Blake's sharp right-hand man, with a smirk that always carries a cruel irony, never directly engages, but is always the one to initiate bullying with words as sharp as knives. Matt Douglas, a guy with bulging muscles, but a head too dull to do anything other than punch and kick, is always the first to dive in when force is needed. Connor Mitchell, who takes pleasure in psychological manipulation, spreads rumors and stirs up gossip, turning victims into the laughingstock of the entire school. And lastly, Chase Walker, quiet but the most intimidating of the group. He never shows any emotion, never needs words to threaten anyone. He simply acts coldly and mercilessly. They are not your typical bullies. They are the ones who set the order of Brookside High, deciding who gets to fit in, who lives on the margins, who can walk with their head held high, and who must walk with their head down silently. Whenever they pass through the halls, people like them don't just use punches or simple insults. They love to watch their victims gradually lose their self-confidence, pushed to the bottom of the food chain, turned into entertainment for the whole school. And when Jamal Carter arrives, he unknowingly signs himself up to be their target. A new student is supposed to flatter, try to fit in, and be careful not to upset the wrong people. But Jamal doesn't do that. He doesn't try to make friends, doesn't show fear or confusion, doesn't try to prove himself, doesn't show even the slightest hesitation under their scrutinizing gazes. He simply doesn't care. And that indifference bothers Blake and his group more than anything else. In their eyes, Jamal isn't someone worthy of respect, nor is he interesting enough to make friends with. He's the perfect prey, a kid with no one to protect him, a stranger to this town, a black boy in a sea of similar faces. And that means he will pay the price. The lunch that day was nothing special. Just the usual cold trays of food, groups of friends gathered according to the unspoken rules of the school, the sounds of laughter mingling with the clattering of forks and trays, and somewhere in the background, whispers about the new student. But amidst all the familiar things, there was something different, something that made some people uncomfortable, though they couldn't pinpoint why. Jamal Carter, sitting alone in the corner, quietly eating, completely uninterested in the world around him. No one sat with him, no one spoke to him, but no one saw him as out of place or awkward either. He simply existed, standing there like an invisible person in a world not meant for him. The way he kept his distance, the way he didn't seem to care about the scrutinizing gazes of others, all of it made him a paradox in the eyes of those who were used to defining the order of Brookside High. At the table across the cafeteria, Blake Harrison had been watching all of it. He wasn't the type to pay attention to people who didn't matter, but today something felt off. Jamal wasn't like the other new students. Kids who moved to this town typically fell into two categories. Either they tried to fit in, seeking approval from the influential groups, or they were weak, easy prey from the moment they stepped foot in school. But Jamal didn't fit either category. He wasn't trying to make friends, nor did he appear scared or awkward. He simply didn't care, and that bothered Blake in a strange way. No one ignored him. No one could act like he didn't exist. At Brookside High, he was the one who set the rules, the one who decided who could walk with their head held high and who had to lower their gaze when passing through the hallways. And someone like Jamal, a black kid from out of town with no one to back him up, someone who dared to ignore his presence, couldn't exist without being punished. Blake pushed his tray away, stood up decisively. Ryan, Matt, Connor, and Chase immediately understood. No need for him to give orders. They stood up with him, forming a slow-moving wall as they made their way to the corner of the room where Jamal still sat, calm, as though the whole cafeteria didn't exist except for him. A loud bang echoed as Blake slammed his hand on the table, making Jamal's tray shake slightly. But he didn't flinch. Not a raised eyebrow, no awkwardness, no sign that he was surprised or upset. He simply continued eating as if he was completely unaware of the 5 figures now standing before him. Blake leaned forward, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear, intentionally so. "Don't see you on the football team," he said, pausing, narrowing his eyes at Jamal as if sizing up his prey before making a move. "You know how to play, or are you just good at running?" A few laughs erupted from the nearby tables. Heads started to turn, attention shifting toward Jamal. But he still didn't respond. No forced smile, no embarrassment, no rebuttal. He just continued eating, his eyes remaining unnervingly calm. Ryan, standing next to Blake, smirked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Or maybe he doesn't speak English. Connor chuckled, nudging Matt as though he'd heard a brilliant joke. Matt, as usual, laughed loudly, excited. Chase said nothing, but his gaze silently observed everything, ready to act if a fight broke out. And then, under the waiting eyes of everyone in the cafeteria, Jamal set down his fork, picked up his tray, stood up, and walked away. Without saying a word. Without a glance. Without any sign that he felt offended or intimidated. The atmosphere shifted for a moment. Those who had been waiting for an argument, an angry response, or at least some sign of discomfort from Jamal were caught off guard and a bit disappointed. The cafeteria fell silent for a brief second before murmurs began to rise. Blake watched Jamal's retreating figure, his eyes darkening. He couldn't believe what had just happened. He was used to controlling situations, to making people respond to him the way he wanted, through fear, submission, or anger. But Jamal had done none of that. He didn't know how to handle this situation. Blake clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists as he sat back down. Ryan leaned in, his voice low but sharp. "Who does this guy think he is?" Matt frowned, still confused. "I think he doesn't know the rules here." Connor smirked. "He's just trying to act different, but we all know guys like him are never really strong. They just need to be put in their place." Blake didn't say anything for a moment. His eyes remained locked on the cafeteria doors where Jamal had disappeared. The laughter and whispers around him faded into the background as his mind worked through his next move. He had never been ignored like this before. He wasn't just going to let it go. He wouldn't allow Jamal to walk around like he didn't exist. If he wanted to be different, then Blake would make sure he stood out in a way he would regret. Ryan noticed Blake's expression and chuckled. "You got a plan?" Blake didn't answer immediately. He just smiled slowly, a smile without warmth. The others understood instantly. The game had officially begun. It started small. At first, it was just little things. An accidental bump in the hallway, a shove that made Jamal stumble slightly. Each time, Ryan or Matt would smirk and say, "Oh, sorry, didn't see you there." Then it escalated. One day, when Jamal opened his locker, a cup of water was dumped onto his books, soaking the pages, blurring the ink into an unreadable mess. Connor stood a few steps away, whistling mockingly as he watched the scene unfold. Jamal didn't react. He didn't glare, didn't rush to clean up the mess like a humiliated weakling. He just quietly took his books, shook the water off the covers, and walked away without a glance back. That only made Blake's group angrier. To them, a victim had to show submission, had to be scared or awkward, had to fight back weakly and then accept their place in the food chain. But Jamal didn't. He walked down the hall like no one existed around him, like all the provocations were nothing more than a passing breeze. Blake gritted his teeth. He couldn't let this go on. He decided to take it up a notch. One day, rumors suddenly started spreading through the school. He got expelled for fighting. His parents moved here to escape trouble. I heard he almost killed someone once. Connor took charge of this, whispering the stories to each small group, letting them spread and mutate into even scarier versions with every retelling. Within a week, people began to whisper as Jamal passed by. Eyes wary, heads turning, conversations abruptly stopping when he came near. But even surrounded by the storm of rumors, Jamal didn't react. He didn't explain himself, didn't deny anything, didn't try to defend himself. He just kept walking through it all like a ghost, unbothered by the world. Blake started to feel something wasn't right. Every student who had been bullied had a breaking point. Some broke instantly, some endured longer, but eventually they cracked. But Jamal was different. Blake could sense it instinctively. There was something about him that wasn't like the others. He needed to test it. And he decided this time, Jamal would have no choice but to react. That night, Jamal left the school library later than usual. He enjoyed the quiet of the place at night, where he could read without being disturbed, where he could focus on the pages instead of the gazes around him. But as he stepped outside the building, the atmosphere around him felt different. A heavy silence hung in the air. He felt it immediately. Footsteps. Light. Steady. But not of one person. Jamal didn't turn around immediately. He knew that once he turned, it would mean he acknowledged their presence. But when he reached the intersection near the sports field, he stopped. Not because he was scared, but because he knew this was bound to happen sooner or later. "You think you can keep ignoring us?" Blake's voice came from behind, low but mocking. As Jamal slowly turned, he saw Blake, Ryan, Matt, Connor, and Chase blocking his way, their faces clearly showing their intentions. He had been cornered. "Don't worry, no one's here to witness this," Ryan said, his voice almost cheerful, as if this was just a game everyone had to play. Matt cracked his knuckles and stepped forward just a little. "Just a little chat. No one wants things to get tense, right?" Jamal didn't answer. He just looked at Blake, calm, neither surprised nor scared. That only made Blake more frustrated. "You're going to learn to respect us." Blake stepped closer, leaning down to look Jamal in the eye. But just as he took a step forward, Jamal gently tilted his head, a small but purposeful movement, as if he were assessing the situation, as if he were weighing his options. Blake suddenly realized this was the first time Jamal had really looked him in the eye. And in that moment, he felt something wasn't right. Jamal's eyes held no fear. No sign of weakness. Nothing but a dangerous calm. And then, before anyone could react, everything changed in an instant. Jamal moved faster than anyone in Blake's group could imagine. Before Matt could even throw a punch, Jamal spun around and twisted his wrist in a precise lock. Matt screamed, crumpling to the ground in pain, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Blake's eyes widened in shock. What the hell just happened? Jamal stood there, still holding his calm demeanor, as if what had just happened was nothing out of the ordinary. He exhaled softly, then spoke for the first time ever. "I've been trying to avoid this. but you're not worth me being afraid of. The air in the alley became thick, as if something invisible was pressing down on it. There were no more laughs, no more loud taunts like usual. Only 5 figures surrounding Jamal, their eyes gleaming with a mix of aggression and anticipation. Blake stood at the center, his face calm, but there was a cold hint of amusement in his gaze. "Listen, kid, no one's going to help you here." Blake took a step forward, his voice not loud, but enough to make one thing clear. This was not a chance encounter but a warning. A carefully staged event. Not to tease like in the cafeteria. Not to play around like in the hallways. But to settle an unresolved issue. Jamal sighed lightly. Not out of fear, but because he knew this moment would come sooner or later. He had tried to take the path of silence, tried not to pay attention to the provocations, tried to walk as if they didn't exist. But the problem with people like Blake was that they didn't want to be ignored. He didn't just want to teach Jamal a lesson. He wanted to see him afraid, to see him submit, to see him look at him as if he controlled everything. But Jamal would never do that. He looked around, fully aware of his situation. There was no one nearby. The shops on the street had closed early. The yellow street lamps cast faint, diffused light onto the road, elongating the distorted shadows of Blake's group on the sidewalk. 5 of them. All waiting for a reaction. Like wolves circling their prey. Matt, the most impulsive of the group, was the first to act. He stepped forward, grabbed Jamal by the collar, yanked him hard, forcing him to look into his eyes. The first mistake. The moment Matt's hand made contact, Jamal moved. No warning. No sign. In the blink of an eye, he tilted his body, twisted Matt's wrist behind him with a smooth lock, and, at the same time, snapped his wrist with a precise twist, causing him to scream in pain. Before anyone could react, Jamal used the momentum to pull sharply, lowering his center of gravity, and slammed Matt to the pavement so fast he didn't even understand what happened. The sound of Matt's body hitting the sidewalk echoed sharply in the quiet air. Blake's eyes widened, frozen for a brief moment. Ryan paused, no longer wearing his usual mocking grin. Connor instinctively took a step back, his eyes now alert. Chase, the quietest in the group, was the only one to maintain his composure, but there was a clear shift in his gaze. A newfound caution. Blake felt his hands clench into fists as he stared at Matt groaning on the ground, his wrists twisted unnaturally. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Jamal was supposed to be on the ground, not Matt. He could feel the shift in the air, the hesitation creeping into Ryan and Connor's eyes. Even Chase, always cold and unreadable, was watching Jamal differently now. Jamal, on the other hand, simply stood there, his expression calm, his posture completely at ease. It was as if he hadn't just taken down the biggest guy in Blake's group without breaking a sweat. He glanced at Blake, then at the others, and spoke again. "You don't want to do this." His voice was steady, quiet, but it carried weight. It wasn't a threat, but it wasn't a plea either. Blake's jaw tightened. He couldn't back down. Not now. Not after this. If he did, then everything he had built at Brookside High would crumble. People feared him because they believed he was untouchable. If Jamal walked away without being put in his place, then it meant Blake wasn't the one in control anymore. He took a slow step forward, his hands trembling slightly from a mix of adrenaline and frustration. "You think you're better than us?" His voice was sharp, but there was something else in it now, something he wasn't used to feeling. Jamal tilted his head slightly, watching him. "I don't think about you at all." Something inside Blake snapped. He lunged, swinging a punch straight at Jamal's face, putting every ounce of his strength into it. Jamal moved before Blake could even register what happened. He sidestepped smoothly, letting Blake's momentum carry him forward. Then, in a single fluid motion, Jamal grabbed Blake's wrist, twisted it, and swept his legs out from under him. Blake hit the ground hard, his back slamming against the pavement. The impact knocked the wind out of him. He gasped, his body momentarily frozen from the shock. Ryan and Connor exchanged glances, their confidence shaken. Chase, who had remained silent through it all, finally took a slow step forward, his eyes locking onto Jamal. Unlike the others, Chase didn't attack recklessly. He had been watching, analyzing. He wasn't like Matt, who relied on brute strength, or Ryan, who hid behind words. Chase knew how to fight. Jamal turned his gaze toward him, recognizing the difference immediately. Chase wasn't afraid. He was calculating. Testing. For the first time, Jamal shifted slightly, adjusting his stance. He knew Chase wouldn't attack without reason, but if he did, it would be a real fight. The moment stretched, tension thick in the air. Ryan, Connor, and even Blake, still on the ground, watched in silence. Then, after a long pause, Chase exhaled through his nose and took a step back. He turned his head toward Blake and spoke for the first time that night. "It's over." Blake's head snapped up, his face contorted with disbelief. "What?" Chase's eyes remained on Jamal. "We lost." Blake scrambled to his feet, rage flaring in his chest. "We don't lose." Chase finally looked at him. "We just did." Ryan and Connor hesitated before stepping back as well. Matt, still cradling his injured wrist, didn't argue. Jamal watched them carefully, waiting to see if there would be another attack. But Chase simply turned and walked away. Ryan and Connor followed after a brief hesitation, and Matt stumbled after them, his face twisted in pain. Blake stood there, his fists clenched, breathing heavily. He was humiliated. His entire reputation was built on being the one no one dared to challenge, and in one night, Jamal had dismantled everything. The fear, the control, the power, it was slipping through his fingers. He turned to glare at Jamal, his expression burning with hatred. "This isn't over." Jamal met his gaze without emotion. It was over before it started. Blake felt his entire body tense, but he had nothing left to say. He turned sharply and stormed off, disappearing into the night. Jamal stood alone for a few moments, listening to the distant sound of footsteps fading. He exhaled softly, shaking his head. He had tried to avoid this. He had tried to walk away. But people like Blake never let things go. The next morning, the entire school knew what had happened. Rumors spread like wildfire, but for once, they weren't about Jamal. They were about Blake. How he and his group had gone after Jamal and gotten destroyed. How Matt had been taken down in an instant. How Chase had admitted defeat. And most importantly, how Blake had been the one to walk away humiliated. For the first time in years, people weren't afraid to talk about him. They weren't afraid to laugh. Blake Harrison had lost. By lunchtime, everything had changed. When Jamal entered the cafeteria, the usual hush that followed him was different this time. People weren't whispering insults or spreading rumors. They were watching him with something else. Respect. Blake, on the other hand, sat in the far corner of the cafeteria, silent. His group was there, but something was off. They weren't laughing, weren't throwing out their usual taunts. Connor and Ryan looked uneasy. Matt was still nursing his wrist. And Chase sat with his arms crossed, deep in thought. The shift had happened. And Blake knew it. Jamal sat at his usual spot alone as always. But this time, it wasn't because he was being isolated. It was because no one dared to challenge him anymore. Blake clenched his jaw as he watched. His mind raced, trying to figure out how to fix this. How to take back control. He couldn't let this stand. He wouldn't. But deep down, for the first time, he felt something he never thought he would. Doubt. And Jamal, without even trying, had changed everything. Blake sat in the cafeteria, his fists clenched under the table. He could hear the whispers, the quiet murmurs of students who used to lower their gazes when he walked by. Now they were looking at him differently. Some with amusement, some with curiosity, but worst of all, some with indifference. He was no longer the king of Brookside High. And it was all because of Jamal Carter. Ryan shifted uncomfortably beside him, stabbing at his food with his fork. "People are talking, Blake." Blake didn't respond. He knew what Ryan was really saying. People were talking, and not in the way they used to. No one feared them anymore. No one was avoiding eye contact. No one was rushing to get out of their way. He had ruled the school with intimidation for years, and now it was slipping away like sand through his fingers. Connor leaned forward, lowering his voice. We have to do something. We can't just let this slide. Blake finally looked up, his eyes dark and unreadable. What do you think we should do, Connor? Attack him again? That worked so well last time, didn't it? Connor fell silent. Matt, still nursing his injured wrist, muttered, "We should have jumped him all at once." We let him take us out one by one. Chase, who had been silent the whole time, finally spoke. That wouldn't have made a difference. Everyone turned to look at him. Chase's face was calm, but his eyes were sharp. You guys don't get it. Jamal isn't just strong. He's trained. You don't move like that unless you've been taught how to fight. He wasn't scared of us because he knew exactly what we were going to do before we even did it. Blake's jaw tightened. He hated how matter-of-fact Chase sounded, as if he were simply stating a fact. But deep down, he knew Chase was right. Ryan scoffed. So what? We just give up. Let him take over. Chase shook his head. He doesn't want to take over. That's the difference between him and us. He's not looking for power. He just wanted to be left alone. Blake's grip on his fork tightened until his knuckles turned white. He had spent his entire life making sure he was in control. He had built his reputation on fear, on making sure no one ever challenged him. And now, after one night, everything had changed. He wouldn't accept it. He couldn't. Later that afternoon, as students moved through the halls between classes, Blake stood near his locker, watching Jamal from a distance. Jamal was at his own locker, calm as ever, completely unbothered by everything that had happened. It infuriated Blake. He wanted to see anger. He wanted to see frustration. He wanted to see anything that showed Jamal had been affected by their fight. But there was nothing. Just that same unreadable expression, like Blake wasn't even worth his attention. That was what made it worse. Not just that Jamal had beaten him, but that Jamal didn't even care. Blake took a slow breath, forcing himself to think. He needed a new plan. The physical fight was over, and he had lost. But that didn't mean he couldn't win in another way. Jamal was still new here. He didn't have friends, didn't have allies. He was strong, sure, but strength didn't matter if you were standing alone. Blake smirked to himself as an idea formed in his mind. If he couldn't beat Jamal with force, then he would beat him another way. By turning the entire school against him. The next day, the rumors started. But this time, they weren't about Jamal's past. This time, they were about what kind of person he really was. He thinks he's better than everyone else. He's not just quiet, he's arrogant. He looks down on all of us. He only fought Blake because he wanted to humiliate him in front of everyone. Blake had spent years learning how to manipulate people, how to twist narratives to fit his needs. He knew exactly which words to say, which students to target. He didn't need to convince everyone. He just needed to plant the seeds of doubt. At first, the shift was subtle. Students who had looked at Jamal with respect the day before now hesitated. They whispered when he walked by. They watched him with uncertainty. And Jamal, as always, ignored it. But Blake wasn't done. He needed something bigger. Something undeniable. A setup. A few days later, as students gathered outside after school, Blake saw his opportunity. A freshman, small and timid, was struggling to carry a heavy bag of books. Blake and his group watched from a distance as the boy dropped them, papers scattering across the pavement. Blake nodded at Ryan, who immediately walked over to the kid, pretending to help. But instead of handing him his books, Ryan smirked and kicked one of them away. Careful, kid. You don't want to end up like Jamal. The boy looked confused. What? Connor chuckled. Oh, you haven't heard? Jamal doesn't like weaklings. He only respects people who can fight. The freshman's face paled slightly. That's not true. Ryan shrugged. Ask him yourself. See if he helps you. Blake leaned back against the wall, watching as the boy hesitated. He saw the exact moment the doubt crept in. That was all it took. By the time Jamal walked out of the school building, the freshman was standing in the middle of the sidewalk, looking nervous. Students had already gathered, sensing something was happening. Jamal walked past without a glance, as usual, but the boy called out, "Hey, Jamal." Jamal stopped, turning slightly. The boy swallowed hard, then spoke, his voice uncertain. Is it true? Do you really think people who can't fight aren't worth your time? Jamal blinked. What? Blake smiled to himself. Perfect. The freshman hesitated before mumbling. They said you only respect strength. That you don't care about people who can't fight. Jamal's eyes flickered toward Blake's group. He understood immediately. He sighed, shaking his head. That's not true. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Someone in the crowd whispered, then why don't you ever talk to anyone? Another voice. Why do you always act like you're better than us? Blake hid his smirk as he watched it unfold. He didn't need to throw another punch. He didn't need to fight Jamal again. He had already won. Jamal looked around, seeing the shift in the way people were looking at him. They weren't afraid of him anymore, but they weren't admiring him either. They were turning against him. He had never wanted to be a hero. Never wanted to be a leader. He just wanted to be left alone. But now he realized Blake was never going to let that happen. Jamal exhaled slowly. If Blake wanted another fight, he was going to get one. But this time, it wouldn't be with fists. This time, Jamal was going to take him down in a way he would never recover from. Blake watched as the doubt settled into the crowd, his smirk hidden beneath a mask of indifference. He had played this game for years, manipulating people, controlling narratives, making sure he was always the one pulling the strings. Jamal had beaten him in a fight, but that didn't matter. Strength alone wasn't enough to survive in Brookside High. If you controlled the story, you controlled everything. Jamal stood there for a long moment, his gaze moving slowly across the faces of the students surrounding him. He wasn't angry. He wasn't surprised. If anything, he looked disappointed. Finally, he exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. Blake almost laughed out loud. That was it? That was all he had? He expected Jamal to fight back, to defend himself, to argue. But he didn't. And in doing nothing, he had let Blake win. Connor leaned over, whispering, that was too easy. Blake smirked. People are predictable. Ryan chuckled. So what now? We just let him keep sulking around. Blake shook his head. No. We make sure he stays in his place. For the next few days, the shift continued. The admiration Jamal had gained after taking down Blake's group faded. People didn't look at him the same way anymore. They still respected his strength, but they no longer trusted him. Blake had made sure of that. Whispers followed Jamal in the hallways. People hesitated before speaking to him. Some avoided him entirely. It was exactly what Blake wanted. Jamal was strong, sure. But without allies, without support, he was nothing. Jamal, as always, ignored it. He didn't try to explain himself, didn't try to win people over. He just kept moving through the days in silence, as if none of it mattered. But Blake knew better. Everyone had a breaking point. 1 week later, Blake decided it was time for the final move. After school, as students were gathering in the parking lot, Blake and his group stood near the entrance, waiting. Ryan had made sure the right people were around, spreading the word that something big was about to happen. And then Jamal appeared. He walked toward his bike, his movements calm as always. He had just unlocked it when Blake spoke. Hey, Carter. Jamal didn't look up. Not interested. Blake chuckled, stepping closer. What? Too good to talk to us now? Jamal sighed, glancing at him. What do you want, Blake? Blake smirked, making sure the crowd was paying attention. I want to know something. Why are you still here? Jamal raised an eyebrow. What? Blake gestured around. No one likes you, Carter. No one trusts you. You might be tough, but you're alone. You're nothing. So why are you still here? Jamal was quiet for a moment. Then he shook his head. You're still trying, huh? Blake's smirk faltered slightly. Trying what? Jamal leaned on his bike, crossing his arms. To win. To get your power back. But you don't get it, do you? You already lost. Blake scoffed. I don't look like the one who lost. Jamal smiled slightly. It wasn't a smug smile, wasn't mocking. Just knowing. Yeah, you do. You're standing here in front of all these people, trying to prove you're still in control. If you really had power, you wouldn't need to convince anyone. Blake felt his stomach twist. Shut up. Jamal didn't. You think you control this school? You don't. Fear isn't control. You didn't build respect, Blake. You built obedience. And now that it's gone, you don't know what to do. The crowd was completely silent. No one was laughing. No one was whispering. They were listening. Blake clenched his fists. He had to do something. He had to stop this. He stepped forward, lowering his voice. You think you're better than me, Carter? Jamal's expression didn't change. No. I just think you're afraid. Blake moved before he even realized what he was doing. His fist shot forward, aiming for Jamal's face. And just like before, Jamal moved. Effortlessly, smoothly, like he had done this 100 times. He shifted to the side, letting Blake's momentum carry him forward. Then, in a single fluid motion, he grabbed Blake's arm and spun him around. Blake barely had time to process what was happening before he was slammed onto the pavement. Pain shot through his back, his breath leaving his lungs in a choked gasp. Jamal stepped back, looking down at him. This is over. Blake groaned, trying to push himself up, but the damage had already been done. Ryan, Connor, and Matt stood frozen. No one moved to help him. The crowd watched, waiting to see what would happen next. Jamal sighed, then turned and walked away. Blake lay there, staring up at the sky, his vision blurring. And for the first time, he understood. He had lost. Completely. No tricks, no rumors, no manipulation could change that. Jamal hadn't just beaten him in a fight. He had taken away everything Blake had built. The fear, the power, the control. And worst of all, he didn't even care. Blake wasn't the king of Brookside High anymore. And he never would be again. Blake lay on the pavement, his body aching, his pride shattered. The weight of silence pressed down on him, heavier than any punch he had ever taken. He wasn't sure what was worse, the pain in his back or the realization sinking into his mind. No one moved to help him. No one rushed to his side. He could hear murmurs, shifting footsteps, but none of them were coming toward him. He forced himself to look up, his vision still hazy. The crowd was already dispersing. Some students lingered for a moment, glancing at him before shaking their heads and walking away. Others whispered to each other, their expressions unreadable. Ryan and Connor exchanged a look but didn't step forward. Even Matt, who had always been the most eager to follow Blake's lead, hesitated. Chase, as usual, said nothing. He simply turned and walked off, as if this was just another day, another predictable outcome. Blake clenched his jaw, forcing himself up onto his elbows. You're just going to leave? His voice was hoarse, his breath uneven. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. What do you want us to do, man? Blake glared at him. Something. Anything. Connor sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. It's over, Blake. Blake froze. Those words. It's over. He wanted to argue, wanted to lash out, but he couldn't. Because deep down, he knew it was true. For years, he had ruled this school through fear, through manipulation, through control. And now it was all gone. Not because Jamal had taken it from him, but because Jamal had shown everyone that Blake was never as powerful as he made them believe. Blake had spent so much time convincing himself that he was untouchable, that he had forgotten the truth. He wasn't strong. He wasn't invincible. He had just been lucky enough that no one had ever challenged him before. Until Jamal. He pushed himself up, staggering slightly. Ryan and Connor took a step back. Not out of fear, but out of something worse, indifference. Blake had never been alone before. He had always had people behind him, people willing to follow, to enforce his power. But now, standing in the middle of the parking lot, bruised and broken, he realized something terrifying. He wasn't the king of Brookside High anymore. He was just another student. And no one cared. Jamal, meanwhile, had already disappeared down the road, his bike rolling smoothly beneath him. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. For him, this had never been a battle for dominance. He hadn't fought Blake to prove a point. He had fought because he had no other choice. And now that it was over, he was ready to move on. But Brookside High wasn't. The next day, the air in the school felt different. The tension that had always loomed in the hallways, the unspoken fear of crossing Blake and his crew, was gone. Students walked freely, without hesitation. Conversations that had once been whispered were now spoken openly. People who had once avoided eye contact with each other now exchanged nods, small smiles, even greetings. It wasn't that the school had changed overnight. It was that they had realized something. They didn't have to be afraid anymore. Blake still showed up to school. He still walked the same halls, sat in the same classes. But it wasn't the same. People didn't part when he walked by. They didn't rush to please him, to be on his good side. They simply treated him like everyone else. At first, he tried to pretend it didn't bother him. He walked with his shoulders squared, his head held high. But there was no denying the truth. He was invisible. Jamal, on the other hand, was still the same. He still sat alone in the cafeteria, still kept to himself. But now, when people looked at him, it wasn't with fear or distrust. It was with quiet respect. And for the first time, some of them started sitting near him. Not with him, not yet, but near. Close enough that, slowly, the invisible wall that had surrounded him since the first day began to crack. He never asked for it. He never sought it out. But change had come anyway. One afternoon, a week after the fight, Blake found himself lingering outside the school, staring at the empty parking lot. He wasn't sure why he was still here. His friends, if he could even call them that anymore, had left without waiting for him. Maybe that was why he stayed. Because for the first time in his life, he had nowhere to be. No one waiting for him. No one looking to him for guidance, for approval. He was just Blake. And he didn't know who that was. A sound behind him made him turn. Jamal stood a few feet away, unlocking his bike. Blake hesitated. Jamal didn't acknowledge him at first. He finished unlocking the chain, adjusting the seat. Then, finally, he looked up. They stared at each other for a long moment. Blake opened his mouth, but no words came out. Jamal waited. And then, finally, Blake swallowed hard and forced out the words he never thought he would say. "I was wrong." Jamal didn't react right away. He just studied Blake, his expression unreadable. Then, after a moment, he nodded. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't mock him, didn't rub it in. He just nodded. And somehow, that made it worse. Blake had expected anger, expected Jamal to lash out, to make him feel small. Instead, he had given him something Blake didn't deserve. Forgiveness. Jamal got on his bike, pushing off the pavement. Blake stood there, watching him ride away, the weight of everything he had done pressing down on him. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure who he was. But maybe, just maybe, he was finally ready to find out. And Brookside High, the school he had ruled through fear for years, was finally ready to move on without him. The days passed, and Brookside High continued to shift in ways that felt almost unnatural to Blake. The school, once a place where his word was law, no longer revolved around him. Conversations in the hallways no longer hushed when he walked by. People no longer turned their heads to watch him with admiration or fear. It was as if he had become a ghost in his own kingdom. Ryan and Connor still acknowledged him, but it wasn't the same. Their loyalty had always been rooted in power, in being part of something larger than themselves. Now that power was gone, and with it, their unquestioning allegiance. Matt barely spoke to him at all, still bitter about his public humiliation. Chase, the only one Blake had ever truly respected, didn't say much either, but Blake could tell he had made his decision. He had moved on. And then there was Jamal. He didn't act like a victor. He didn't walk around the school as if he had won something. He just existed, the same as before, quiet and distant. But people saw him differently now. They nodded at him in the halls. Some tried to talk to him. Others simply gave him space, but there was no more hostility, no more suspicion. Jamal didn't seek attention, and yet he had gained something Blake never had. Respect. Blake hated it. Not because he wanted people to fear Jamal, but because he had spent his entire life trying to build the thing Jamal had earned without even trying. And now that Blake had lost everything, he wasn't sure what was left. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after the fight, Blake found himself sitting alone at a table in the cafeteria. It was a strange feeling. He was used to people surrounding him, hanging on his every word, waiting for him to speak first. Now, no one even looked in his direction. He glanced up and saw Jamal sitting at his usual spot alone. Only, he wasn't completely alone anymore. A few students sat nearby, not with him, but close enough that it was clear things had changed. Blake scoffed under his breath. He didn't know why he kept watching Jamal. Maybe he was waiting for him to slip up, to reveal that he wasn't as untouchable as he seemed. Or maybe he was just trying to understand. Jamal must have sensed the stare because he suddenly looked up. Their eyes met across the room. Blake expected him to look away, to ignore him. Instead, Jamal held his gaze for a long moment before giving a small nod. Blake frowned. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't a taunt. It was just acknowledgement. And for the first time, Blake didn't feel the urge to glare back. He just nodded in return. It wasn't much. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a conversation. But it was a start. Days turned into weeks, and Brookside High continued to settle into its new reality. The fear that had once hung over the school like a storm cloud had disappeared, replaced by something unfamiliar but welcome. Students who had once walked the halls with their heads down now moved freely. The tension that had once been a constant presence had lifted. Blake had never felt so out of place. For years, he had known exactly who he was. He had been the ruler of Brookside High, the one who decided how things worked, who belonged, and who didn't. Without that, he wasn't sure what he was supposed to be. Ryan and Connor still sat with him at lunch, but the energy was different. There were no more whispered plans, no more scheming, no more conversations about who needed to be put in their place. They still talked, but it was meaningless. Small talk. Empty words. Matt had fully distanced himself. He had never been the brains of the group, but he had enjoyed the power. Without it, he had no reason to stick around. Chase, as expected, had drifted away as well. He had never needed Blake. He had simply played along while it benefited him. Now that it didn't, he had no reason to stay. Blake found himself walking through the halls alone more often than not. He had never realized how much he had relied on his reputation to fill the silence. Without it, he felt exposed. Jamal, on the other hand, hadn't changed much. He still sat alone most days, still kept to himself. But there was a difference. People no longer avoided him. Some greeted him in passing. Others sat nearby. A few even tried to start conversations. He never pushed anyone away, but he never sought anyone out either. He had no need to prove anything to anyone. Blake hated how effortless it was for him. One afternoon, Blake found himself outside after school, leaning against the side of the building, staring at nothing in particular. He wasn't waiting for anyone. He had nowhere to be. The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He turned his head and saw Jamal walking toward the bike rack. For a moment, Blake considered ignoring him. Then, before he could stop himself, he spoke. "Why didn't you finish me?" Jamal paused, glancing at him. "What?" Blake pushed off the wall, shoving his hands into his pockets. "The night of the fight. You could have humiliated me. You could have made sure no one ever took me seriously again." He exhaled sharply. "Why didn't you?" Jamal studied him for a moment, as if deciding whether or not to answer. Then he shrugged. "Because it wasn't about you." Blake frowned. "What does that mean?" Jamal leaned against his bike. "I didn't come here to take anything from you, Blake. I just wanted to be left alone. You were the one who couldn't let it go." Blake clenched his jaw. "You think this is easy for me?" Jamal raised an eyebrow. "No, but it's not supposed to be." Blake let out a bitter laugh. "So what, I just live with it? Walk around every day knowing I used to be someone and now I'm nothing." Jamal was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Maybe instead of trying to be who you were, you figure out who you actually are." Blake looked away. He had no response to that. Jamal climbed onto his bike, preparing to leave. But before he did, he looked at Blake one last time. "You're not nothing. But you have to decide what you want to be now." And with that, he rode off, leaving Blake standing there with nothing but his own thoughts. For the first time, Blake didn't feel angry. He didn't feel humiliated. He just felt lost. But maybe, for the first time, that wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe it meant he was finally ready to start over. The following days passed in a strange blur for Blake. He had spent so long defining himself through power and control that without them, he felt hollow. He wasn't sure what was worse, the way people no longer feared him or the way they simply didn't care. He had thought losing a fight was the worst thing that could happen to him, but he was wrong. Losing his place in the school, losing the identity he had built for himself, that was worse. He found himself avoiding his usual spots, the places where he had once held court. The cafeteria felt suffocating. The hallways were filled with whispers, but none of them were about him anymore. People had moved on. Jamal had moved on. And yet, Blake still felt stuck. One afternoon, long after the final bell had rung, he sat alone on the bleachers behind the school. The field stretched out in front of him, empty and quiet. He had always liked this place. It had been his sanctuary, his throne. Now, it just felt like another reminder of what he had lost. He heard footsteps approaching, but didn't bother looking up. He already knew who it was. Jamal sat down on the bleachers a few feet away, resting his elbows on his knees. He didn't say anything at first. Just sat there, watching the empty field like Blake was. Blake finally let out a breath. "Do you ever get tired of being alone?" Jamal tilted his head slightly, considering the question. "I'm not alone." Blake scoffed. "Really? Because I don't see you hanging out with anyone. You barely talk to people." Jamal shrugged. "Doesn't mean I'm alone." Blake thought about that. He had always surrounded himself with people, made sure he was always in control, always the center of everything. And yet, sitting here now, he felt more alone than ever. Jamal glanced at him. "You don't have to stay like this, you know." Blake shook his head. "And do what? Suddenly start acting like none of it happened? Like I wasn't the guy who made everyone's life hell for years." Jamal didn't look away. "You don't have to pretend it didn't happen. You just have to be better than who you were." Blake let out a dry laugh. "You say that like it's easy." "It's not." Jamal leaned back slightly, watching the sky. "But you don't have another choice, do you?" Blake sat in silence, letting the words settle. For the first time, he let himself really think about it. Not about getting revenge, not about proving himself, but about what came next. Because for the first time in his life, he didn't know. And maybe that was okay. Jamal stood up, dusting off his hands. "You don't have to figure it all out today. Just stop trying to be the guy you used to be. No one's expecting you to be him anymore." Blake looked up at him. "And if I do?" Jamal shrugged. "Then that's on you." He turned and walked away, leaving Blake alone on the bleachers with nothing but the quiet and the weight of his own choices. Blake sat there for a long time, staring at the field, at the empty space where his old life had once existed. He had spent years making sure he was feared, respected, untouchable. But in the end, none of it had mattered. For the first time, he realized he had been fighting the wrong battle all along. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to start over.